Dr. Mike Scheeringa here. Psychological trauma is one of the most common concepts in psychiatry, but it has been undergoing a transformation for the past 20 years, and particularly in the last 10, the usefulness of the concept of trauma has been extended well beyond the doctor's office and become a dominant concept in public health and social policy. Here's what you need to know about what trauma is and what it is not. First, this is a disclaimer that I'm not giving medical advice. I'm simply providing education about terms used in psychiatry and other mental health fields. There are 3 developments you need to know to understand how the definition of trauma and the alleged impact of trauma are being reshaped. In the first part, I'll give a really quick tour of how the use of trauma is being expanded beyond its original intended uses. In the second part, I'll explain the research behind these changes, or lack thereof, and explain what's true or not, including the pros and cons of different efforts to leverage trauma for different purposes. At the end, I'll give my opinion about these things and whether I think they're good or bad for the profession and for society. PTSD was officially created in 1980 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 3rd edition, or DSM-3. To develop PTSD, an individual obviously needs to experience a traumatic event. In the 1980 version of the diagnostic criteria, the event was defined as a stressor that would evoke significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone. But there were significant problems in that first definition. The concept of the stressor was too vague, and research would show that the concept of almost everyone was too broad. In 1987, the 3rd edition of the DSM, or DSM-3R, was published, and the traumatic event was redefined slightly, but in an important way, to be specifically life-threatening. An event was something that had to be sudden and unexpected and create a moment of extreme panic that almost everyone would find life-threatening. The graphic on your screen shows the definition in DSM-3R. Then in DSM-4, in 1994, the traumatic event definition did not change in any substantial way. It still was life-threatening. And you see some examples on your screen of DSM-4 traumatic types of events. In DSM-5, the definition was not changed either in 2013. But almost as early as PTSD was formulated, 3 different developments started up that attempted to mold or transform that definition of trauma into other things. Development number 1. A certain small group of researchers tried to expand the definition of trauma into something that was non-life-threatening stress, as things that could cause PTSD. These types of events could include divorce, farmers who had to put their cattle down due to disease, living around an oil spill, neglect, emotional abuse, most forms of bullying, and watching violent events on television. Stressful events like these are certainly beyond the experiences of most persons, but they do not reach that level of life-threatening. These types of events might cause emotional problems of different types, but rarely, if ever, cause PTSD, and research has been pretty consistent about that, at least solid types of research. Development number 2 was a researcher invented a different type of PTSD. Judith Herman, a psychiatrist, published a paper in 1992 for something called complex PTSD. And there were 2 important changes that she made to the definition that was different than regular PTSD. The types of events were things that were prolonged and repeated, and they must also include a constant context of stress in between events, and these may or may not include life-threatening things. These include prison, being in concentration camps, coerced prostitution, and chronic child abuse. The second main change that she made was expanding the types of symptoms that were possible beyond what were found in regular PTSD. These included a lot of things about emotional and affective regulation, like attachment disturbances, difficulty with interpersonal skills, and emotional dysregulation. The 3rd development that happened was a certain group of researchers invented a completely different type of outcome beyond psychological outcomes. And they postulated that psychological stress in childhood could cause very severe physical diseases in adults. In 1998, a group led by Vincent Folletti published a paper about something called adverse childhood experiences, which is something that they invented. They studied a group of individuals as adults from primary care clinics, and they asked them to retrospectively rate, endorse the types of events they suffered as children. And these included things like psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, exposure to substance abuse of a parent, exposure to a parent with mental illness, witnessing domestic violence, and witnessing criminal behavior in the home. So you can see some of those were traumatic, life-threatening experiences, but many of them were not. Then this group of researchers also assessed what physical ailments these adults had. Things like, very severe things like cancer, heart disease, and they found a correlation, a kind of a dose-response relationship, that the greater number of adverse childhood experiences people had, the more likely they were to have severe medical diseases like heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, hepatitis, and even bone fractures. Since that 1998 paper, there have been at least 20 ACE studies by this particular group and many more ACE studies by other groups, and it has become an extremely popular concept. These three developments have had marked impacts on individual treatment, such as affecting how clinicians diagnose patients, what patients believe about themselves, and inventing different types of treatments for these things. These developments have also had marked impacts on public health and social policy. For example, this has led to something called the trauma-informed approach, which has been expanded beyond the doctor's office into the criminal justice system, education in schools, pediatric screening, and many other areas. I think it would be fair to say that the activists of trauma-informed approaches are intent on drastically reshaping public health, social policy, and how taxpayer dollars are allocated to support their beliefs. These events have already had lots of effects. 3 states have passed laws or resolutions indicating that they should follow trauma-informed approaches in California, Wisconsin, and Maryland. Major cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New Orleans have passed resolutions or policies to determine how taxpayer dollars are spent on public health efforts. Nearly every government agency that has to do with children or disadvantaged groups has endorsed these concepts, like complex trauma, as fact, and nearly every professional group that deals with children, women, disadvantaged populations have also endorsed these things as if they are facts. In the second part, I'll describe what's known in the research evidence on whether these things are facts or not. For the first development, is there any evidence for the expansion of the types of events beyond life-threatening events to be able to cause PTSD? The problem with the study methods used in much of the research is the difference between self-report questionnaires and interviewers who are trained to ask about these types of things. In self-report questionnaires, respondents are allowed to endorse stress as life-threatening events, even though they're not, and if they endorse enough symptoms of PTSD by mistake or by misunderstanding, then it looks like they have PTSD when they really don't. This flawed design allows for a lot of what we call false positives. They're considered to have PTSD in the study, but they don't really have it. The better method is to use interviewers who are trained. So interviewers can ask follow-up questions and they can clarify misunderstandings to determine if something is really severe enough to be a symptom and if the person really understands the question. So the question for this is, are there really good, well-designed studies that validate the idea that non-life-threatening experiences like divorce and financial losses can cause PTSD? When I look at the studies, I don't see that good kind of study that uses interviewers. Nearly all of the research that gets cited for these types of events are based on self-report questionnaires, and I think they involve nearly all false positives. I've personally done a lot of research with both types of these methods, and I've seen examples firsthand of how people can endorse things that aren't really traumatic. For the second development, is there evidence to support the idea that a different type of disorder besides regular PTSD is valid or needed? The main problem that I see is that when you're trying to validate a new disorder, for every disorder, even in the rest of medicine, you need to start with case reports. You need to identify at least one individual who has this supposed new disorder and carefully track the onset of the symptoms and the clinical course to determine that it's different from things that have been described before. Researchers have never been able to provide a single case study of complex PTSD that showed this important sequence of events. They've never published a case that shows an individual who did not have all these extra symptoms of complex PTSD and then experienced this complex type of repeated and prolonged stressful plus or minus traumatic events and then developed all these symptoms of PTSD. Instead of doing that kind of basic work, researchers have produced a lot of fancy statistical papers that have relied on something called latent analysis. That sounds important, but it's the wrong kind of study to do for diagnostic validation. A critique of the studies of complex PTSD is complicated and takes too much time than I can devote in this video. The short story is there is nothing close to adequate diagnostic validation of complex PTSD. I discuss the research at length in my book, and if you're interested, I'll do another show on it. Belief in something that's not real, like complex PTSD, causes problems. A good example that illustrates that is I had a communication with a person who responded to one of my blogs, and this person told me that she had experienced complex trauma and believed that she had complex PTSD and that she didn't believe all my knowledge about research and clinical experience. I replied to her that I think that's great if you believe in complex PTSD and that's helped you in your recovery, but just because it's helped you, there's lots of things that help people that don't have to be true, and just because it's helped you doesn't mean the rest of us have to adopt it as an official diagnostic category. For the third development, is there any evidence to support the expansion of trauma as something that can cause physical diseases in adults? The main thing that you need to know is that 100% of these studies, these adverse childhood experience studies, have been cross-sectional study designs. That means people were studied at only one point in time as adults. Their reports about their childhood experiences were retrospective and could be faulty. These cross-sectional studies rely on a correlation, and it's well known in every field of research that correlation does not mean causation. People could have developed these diseases as adults for other reasons, and there's no proof that they developed them because of these childhood experiences. And it may be that people who experience childhood experiences that are stressful also develop physical diseases as adults for third reasons that connected to, but that doesn't mean that the stressful experiences cause the diseases in adults, and you can't prove that without a prospective longitudinal study design. Belief in the ACEs studies is problematic because, as I mentioned, states, cities, and agencies have adopted this concept of ACEs as if it's a fact, and this is driving a lot of policy changes and screening programs that are based on faulty scientific knowledge. Now in the third part, I'll give my interpretation of what I think's happened and why I think it's happened. There are at least two noteworthy and unusual aspects of these attempts to transform trauma. First, all of these developments were attempts to expand the reach of trauma as opposed to narrow it. These attempts weren't driven by the usual process of science built on a series of well-supported empirical findings. So what is this really about? And I think it's the second thing is what it's really about is that these efforts have been aimed at having a larger social impact that goes beyond medical practice. There are a lot of concerning implications for the directions of social programs and the misuse of science. I described the underlying driving concept for these things in my book, but the short version goes something like this. Professionals whose job is to protect and care for disadvantaged groups of children and women understood by the 1990s that they were never going to totally eradicate trauma, violence, and mistreatment. I describe it as them realizing that even though a lot of progress had been made in previous decades, they had hit a wall and they were never going to have enough resources to attack all of these problems and make them go away. But then a handful of people figured out different ways to use the concept of trauma and PTSD to get more attention for their causes. These ideas were invented by researchers who were concerned about the level of stress and violence in children's lives, and they believed that if they could show a link between stress and physical disease, it would be able to supercharge public health and social policy changes. Judith Herman figured out in 1992 that lumping non-trauma in with trauma would allow her to create a new disorder, complex PTSD, that sounded much more dangerous than just PTSD. The effect on treatment has been generally bad, in my opinion. Vincent Folletti figured out in 1998 that by lumping non-trauma with trauma in his ACE conceptualization, that this could be linked to physical disease as a correlation and made to sound much more dangerous. These are just two of the key historical events, and there are others, but the point is that what I think happened is that in the service of trying to prevent medical and mental problems in disadvantaged populations, well-intentioned humanitarian individuals learned how to weaponize trauma and neuroscience with bad research studies and misinformation, and leverage the concept of trauma to get more attention from legislators, courts, schools, and other agencies. It seems they think that they are helping disadvantaged groups of people, but they've gone way beyond the data and created new constructs that are based on their belief systems. Which definition of trauma we use is important for communication. We need to be able to talk with each other and have words mean the same thing. It's particularly important for research. Research rests on the foundation that the things we measure have to be clear and replicable, or else it's impossible to compare the results of one study to the next. In regards to PTSD, the relevant definition of trauma is the narrow definition that trauma involves life threats to individuals. That's all for now. To learn more, I'd recommend watching my next episodes on what is PTSD, and then episodes on complex PTSD and toxic stress. Comments are welcome. Let me know if there's a topic you'd like me to cover. If you found this helpful, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel.